Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time to one of the loudest, hottest, most physically punishing jobs in all of human history, the medieval blacksmith. Picture yourself standing in a low-ceilinged stone building, maybe 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, and the temperature inside is hovering somewhere around the surface of a very angry star. Sparks are raining down on your forearms like tiny, enthusiastic comets. Your hammer weighs about as much as a small child. Your ears haven't stopped ringing since Tuesday, and it is 4:30 in the morning. You haven't eaten yet. The good news is that you probably won't survive this, at least not with all your fingers intact. But the worst news is that this is considered a respectable, even enviable profession in the year, let's say 1200 AD. Lucky you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing someone from New Zealand watching this at 2 in the morning next to someone from Ohio who is supposed to be asleep before their Monday meeting. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are a medieval blacksmith, and before we get into the truly spectacular misery of your daily existence, let's set the scene properly, because the smithy itself, the building, the layout, the atmosphere, is its own particular kind of hell, and it deserves a moment of respectful acknowledgement. The smithy is, at its core, a forge. That word, forge, comes from the Latin fabrica, meaning workshop, and over centuries it has come to mean specifically a place where metal is heated and shaped. Historians still argue whether the earliest dedicated smithing structures in medieval Europe were purpose-built or adapted from existing buildings, but what most agree on is that by the high medieval period, the smithy had a fairly recognizable form. It was small. It was dark except for the light of the fire. It was loud in a way that you genuinely cannot appreciate until you have stood next to an anvil being struck repeatedly with a 2-kilogram hammer at 5 in the morning. And it was hot in a manner that made every other kind of hot summer afternoons, fever, spicy food, seem like a polite suggestion rather than a physical reality. The central feature of your world is the forge itself, which is essentially a controlled fireplace with attitude. It is typically built from stone or brick and sits at about waist height, which sounds ergonomic until you realize you will be hunched over it for the better part of 10 to 14 hours a day. The fire in the forge is not a wood fire, at least not primarily. You burn charcoal and later, in some regions, coal, because these fuels burn hotter and longer than wood and because wood ash creates compounds that can interfere with the properties of the metal you are working. Charcoal, produced by slowly burning wood in a low-oxygen environment, can reach temperatures of around 1,100 degrees Celsius when air is actively forced through it, which brings us to one of your most important pieces of equipment and also one of your most exhausting responsibilities. The bellows. The bellows is a large, accordion-like device, typically made from wood and animal hide, often goat or cow, and its job is to pump air into the base of the forge fire, dramatically increasing the temperature. Without the bellows, your fire is just a fire. With the bellows, your fire becomes something that can melt iron, or at least bring it to a working temperature, which for most medieval ironwork sits somewhere between 900 and 1,300 degrees Celsius depending on what you are doing. And who operates the bellows? Well, if you are a master smith with a workshop and an apprentice, the apprentice operates the bellows. But if you are a younger smith, a journeyman working alone, or a smith in a very small rural operation, the answer is you do. You pump those bellows while simultaneously monitoring the color of the metal in the fire, because the color is your thermometer. Bright orange means one temperature. Yellow-white means another. You have no instruments, no gauges, no digital readout. You have your eyes, your experience, and whatever wisdom your master managed to beat into you during your apprenticeship years. Color reading is one of those skills that sounds poetic when described from a comfortable distance but is absolutely critical and absolutely unforgiving in practice. If you let your iron get too cold, it won't move properly under the hammer, it'll crack. If you let it get too hot, you can burn the metal, causing its carbon structure to degrade in ways that compromise the strength of your final product. There is a color that medieval smiths called sparkling white, or sometimes described with language that translates roughly as the metal is angry, and that color means you have gone too far. You have overheated your iron and introduced oxygen into its surface in a way that creates a brittle, oxidized layer. If you are making a horseshoe, this is unfortunate. If you are making a sword blade for a knight who has very strong opinions about sword quality, this could be significantly worse than unfortunate. Now, the layout of the smithy beyond the forge includes your anvil, which is the great iron block on which you do your hammering. Medieval anvils varied in shape and weight, but the iconic form with a flat working surface, a horn projecting from one end for shaping curves, and a step or heel at the other end, was well established by the high medieval period. Anvils were enormously valuable. A good anvil might cost more than many craftsmen earned in months, and they were passed down through generations with the seriousness of a family heirloom. The anvil sits on a large wooden stump, ideally of hardwood like oak or elm, both to absorb shock and to bring it to a working height. The stump itself is often partially buried or wedged in the earthen floor to keep it from walking across the room every time you strike it, which it absolutely will do if not properly secured. Around the forge and anvil, you have your tool rack or simply a collection of tools hanging from hooks or leaning against the wall. These include hammers of various weights, a heavier hammer for moving large amounts of metal quickly, a lighter one for detail and finishing work, as well as tongs in multiple configurations for holding different shapes of hot metal. You have hardies, which are chisel-like tools that sit in a square hole in your anvil called the hardy hole, allowing you to cut or shape metal against them. You have punches for making holes, flatters for smoothing surfaces, swages for creating specific cross-sectional shapes. Each of these tools, in a very real sense, is something you either made yourself, inherited from a previous smith, or saved for months to purchase. Losing a tool, damaging a tool, or having a tool stolen is not a minor inconvenience. It is a financial catastrophe. The floor of your smithy is almost certainly earthen, packed dirt, because stone or wood floors would be fire hazards when hot scale, which is the oxidized outer layer that flakes off hot metal during hammering, rains down constantly during work. Scale is fascinating stuff, actually. It is mostly iron oxide, and it collects on the floor of a working smithy over years and decades until the floor is literally built up from the accumulated history of thousands of working sessions. Archaeologists excavating medieval smithy sites sometimes find these scale-rich floor deposits and use them to understand everything from what kinds of metal were being worked to roughly what era the smithy was in operation. Your floor is, in other words, a kind of slow-motion autobiography written in iron rust. The smithy has a water trough, a long, narrow container filled with water or sometimes brine, for quenching metal. Quenching is the process of rapidly cooling hot metal by plunging it into liquid, and it is how you harden steel. The chemistry of why this works involves the transformation of the iron's crystalline structure, specifically a phase called austenite converting to martensite, but in your medieval present you do not think about it in those terms. You think about it in terms of experience, tradition, and the specific hiss and cloud of steam that tells you whether the quench went right. Historians still argue whether medieval smiths fully understood the carbon chemistry underlying their craft or operated primarily on empirical knowledge. That is, they knew what worked without necessarily knowing why it worked. The answer is probably both, depending on the individual smith, the era, and whether they had access to written technical traditions. There is also typically a slack tub, a smaller vessel of water used for cooling tools, and your own burned hands, which is a thing that happens frequently, with a regularity that you have long since stopped remarking upon. And then there is the light situation. Your smithy has, at best, 1 or 2 small windows, and they are not glazed. Glass is expensive and the heat would be an issue anyway. The primary light source, other than whatever pale dawn is filtering through the door, is the forge fire itself. This means that in the corners of your workshop, it is quite dark, and the play of firelight over everything gives the smithy a particular visual character that observers throughout history have found dramatic and impressive and slightly unsettling. There is a reason that folklore across dozens of cultures associates the blacksmith's forge with magic, with the supernatural, with transformation. You stand in firelight, pulling glowing metal from fire, shaping it with what looks from the outside like your bare hands, and you make ordinary raw material into something that was not there before. It looks like sorcery. We will come back to that particular complication later, because it causes you a rather interesting set of social problems. For now, note the smell. The smithy smells of coal or charcoal smoke, of hot metal, of the particular sharp tang of scale hitting the floor, of your own sweat, which is considerable, and of the leather of your apron, which has been scorched so many times it has a permanent campfire quality. The apron is your primary protection. It covers your torso and thighs and is made of thick, stiff leather, and it catches sparks that would otherwise burn holes directly through you. You also wear leather gloves, though not always, because thick gloves reduce your sensitivity and your ability to control your tools, so experienced smiths often go barehanded and simply accept the network of small burn scars that accumulates on their hands, wrists, and forearms over a career. You started work this morning before the sun came up. Not because you are particularly ambitious, but because the social rhythms of the medieval village or town demand it. Farmers need their tools before they go into the fields. Horses need to be shod before they go to work. The knight's whatever it is needs to be repaired before the knight has a chance to come into your shop and express his dissatisfaction with the delay, which is the kind of interaction you would very much like to avoid. So you were at the forge by 4:30 at the latest, pumping the bellows to bring the fire up to temperature, and the day stretches ahead of you until somewhere between dusk and complete physical collapse, whichever comes first. This is not a job you chose in the modern sense of the word. This is a job that, in many cases, chose you, or rather, was chosen for you by the circumstances of your birth, your family's connections, or the particular economic needs of the community in which you found yourself. And before you could even hold a hammer properly, you had to survive a process that was less like job training and more like a prolonged test of your willingness to endure discomfort for the theoretical promise of a better future. But that is the next part of the story. For now, just stand here for a moment. Feel the heat on your face. Listen to the bellows breathing. Watch the fire shift from red to orange in the heart of the forge, climbing slowly toward the working temperature that will let you begin. It is not yet 5 in the morning. The day is just getting started. And if you are very lucky, and luck, you have learned, is not something that descends on blacksmiths with any particular frequency, all of your fingers will still be attached by the time the sun goes down. You did not walk into this life. You were deposited into it, usually somewhere between the ages of 7 and 12, by a parent or guardian who had made an arrangement with a master smith, an arrangement that sounded on the surface like an opportunity. Your family may have paid a fee for the privilege of handing you over. Let that sit for a moment. They paid someone to take you. In return, the master smith agreed to house you, feed you, clothe you, and teach you his craft over a period of typically 7 years, at the end of which you would emerge as a trained journeyman blacksmith, theoretically equipped to make your way in the world. That was the agreement on paper, or rather on the handshake and witnessed verbal contract that served as paper in a world where most people could not read. The reality of apprenticeship in medieval Europe was, depending on your master, somewhere on a spectrum between moderately unpleasant and genuinely traumatic. And the thing is, nobody at the time would have described it as either of those things. They would have called it normal. They would have called it necessary. They would have called it the way things are done, which is the most powerful argument any society ever deploys in defense of its worst habits. Let's start with the hierarchy, because the hierarchy is everything in a medieval smithy. At the top sits the master, the magister in Latin documents, or simply the maître or meister depending on where in Europe you find yourself. The master owns the shop, owns the tools, owns the contracts with clients, and owns, in a very real economic sense, your labor for the duration of your apprenticeship. Below the master, in larger operations, you might find one or more journeymen. Smiths who have completed their apprenticeships and are now qualified to work for wages but have not yet established their own workshops. And at the bottom, performing every task that the journeymen consider beneath them and the master has long since stopped doing himself, is you. Your day begins before everyone else's. You are the one who wakes the forge. You carry the charcoal or coal. You pump the bellows in the cold pre-dawn until the fire is ready, and only then do you go about whatever other morning tasks have been assigned to you, which might include cleaning the shop floor, fetching water for the slack tub and the drinking supply. Those were ideally different containers, though in chaotic workshops this was not always observed with perfect rigor, feeding whatever animals the master keeps, and preparing the master's breakfast. Yes, you are also, in many documented cases, a domestic servant. The line between craft apprentice and household help was remarkably blurry in the medieval period, and masters routinely extracted domestic labor from their apprentices as a matter of course. The legal framework governing apprenticeship varied across time and place, but in much of medieval Europe it was formalized through the guild system, which we will examine in much more detail later. Guild regulations theoretically protected apprentices by specifying what a master could and could not demand. He was supposed to teach you the craft. He was supposed to provide adequate food and lodging. He was not supposed to work you literally to death. These protections existed in writing, and historians still argue whether they were consistently enforced, sporadically applied, or largely decorative depending on the relative power of the master versus the guild's interest in maintaining standards. The honest answer is probably all three at different times and places. What the regulations generally did not prohibit was physical correction. This is the polite term that contemporary records use. Correction. A master had the right, the legally and socially recognized right, to strike his apprentice as a disciplinary measure, in the same way that a father might strike a child, and the comparison was not accidental. The master stood in legal loco parentis, in the place of a parent, for the duration of the apprenticeship, and the physical discipline that was considered acceptable for parents in medieval Europe was considerable by modern standards. Striking an apprentice with an open hand, a strap, or a rod was not abuse. It was pedagogy. It was, in the sincere belief of masters and parents and guild officials alike, how you made a boy into a craftsman. Now, it is important to note that not all masters were brutal, and not all apprenticeships were miserable. Some masters were patient teachers who genuinely invested in their apprentices' development, recognized that a well-trained journeyman was in their long-term interest, and maintained workshops that were harsh but fair by the standards of the time. Historians still argue whether the master-apprentice relationship was more often exploitative or genuinely educational, and the evidence suggests enormous variation, which is perhaps the least comforting possible conclusion, because it means that the quality of your life as an apprentice was almost entirely dependent on the character of the specific adult who had legal authority over you, and you had essentially no mechanism for vetting that before you arrived. If your master was one of the good ones, your 7 years looked something like this. You spent the first year or two doing almost nothing but observing and performing unskilled labor, carrying things, cleaning things, pumping the bellows, which seems simple but is genuinely skilled work because the bellows rhythm has to match the needs of the fire and the pace of the master's work. You watched how the master read the color of the metal. You watched how he held his hammer, and this is not a trivial observation, because hammer technique in blacksmithing is a complex kinesthetic skill that involves your whole body, not just your arm, and learning to strike efficiently and accurately takes months of practice before it starts to become natural. You were not given a hammer and told to have at it. You were told to watch, and watch, and watch some more. This was frustrating in the same way that being told to observe a swimming lesson from the pool deck is frustrating. You could see the action, but you could not yet access the embodied knowledge that makes it possible. Gradually, and this gradualness was itself a form of gatekeeping, a demonstration that the master controlled the pace of your development entirely, you were allowed to try simple tasks. Filing, grinding, holding workpieces with tongs while the master hammered. Making nails, which were one of the classic beginner's exercises in a blacksmith's education precisely because they required you to practice multiple fundamental techniques. Drawing out the metal, forming the head, cutting to length in a single small object that had real commercial value and could be sold if it was good enough. A competent apprentice making nails was a productive apprentice, and the master knew this, which meant your nail-making sessions were also, from his perspective, paid labor extracted at the cost of your food and lodging. Nails, by the way, were serious business in the medieval world. Every wooden building, every piece of furniture, every ship and cart and fence required enormous numbers of them, and they were made entirely by hand, one at a time, by smiths or specialist nailers who spent their days in exactly this repetitive loop. Heat the iron rod, pull it from the fire, draw out the point, cut it off, form the head, toss it in the bucket, start again. A skilled nailer could produce several hundred nails in a day. An apprentice learning the skill might manage a few dozen before exhaustion and error caught up with them. The difference was not strength. It was efficiency, the elimination of wasted motion, the perfect calibration of hammer strike to metal movement, the reading of color that told you exactly how many strikes you had before you needed to reheat. That efficiency took years to build, and during those years your nails were slower and occasionally worse, and your master let you know about it. Let's talk about food, because food matters enormously when you are a growing child performing heavy physical labor for 12 hours a day. What you were fed as an apprentice depended almost entirely on your master's resources and inclinations. Guild regulations in some cities specified that apprentices must receive adequate meals, but adequate was doing a lot of work in that sentence. In a prosperous urban workshop with good clients, you might eat reasonably well bread, pottage, which was a thick stew of vegetables and occasionally meat, ale rather than water because water was frequently unsafe, and seasonal produce when available. In a struggling rural smithy, you might eat the master's table scraps and thank whoever you prayed to that there were scraps at all. The ale situation is worth a brief pause, because it surprises modern listeners. Medieval people of all ages, including apprentices and children, drank ale regularly, not because medieval culture had relaxed views on childhood drinking, but because the fermentation process made ale significantly safer to drink than the local water supply, which was frequently contaminated with agricultural runoff, animal waste, and whatever the upstream neighbors were doing with their latrines. The ale consumed daily in medieval life was typically quite low in alcohol, significantly weaker than modern beer, and served primarily as a hydration source that would not give you dysentery, which in the medieval calculus was a significant point in its favor. Lodging as an apprentice meant sleeping in the master's house, usually in the worst available space. A loft above the smithy, a corner of the kitchen near the hearth, which sounds warm and pleasant until you consider the smoke. A space shared with other apprentices, which at least provided companionship, or a space alone in a cold outbuilding, which provided neither warmth nor company. Your bedding was typically a straw pallet, a cloth sack stuffed with hay or straw, which was comfortable enough by medieval standards, somewhat less comfortable than a modern person might prefer, and home to a rotating population of fleas, lice, and occasionally bedbugs, all of whom considered your warmth as much their right as yours. You were, during your apprenticeship, legally prohibited from a remarkable array of activities. Depending on your guild's regulations, you could not marry. You could not set up your own business. You could not take work from outside your master's shop. You could not leave the master's service without permission, and leaving without permission was grounds for legal action. In some jurisdictions, you could be compelled to return, fined, or have your future prospects within the guild formally damaged. You were, in a meaningful sense, not quite a free person for the duration of your indenture. The term indenture, incidentally, comes from the Latin indentura, referring to the practice of writing a contract on a piece of parchment and then cutting it with an indented or jagged edge. The master kept one half, the apprentice's family kept the other, and if a dispute arose, the two pieces could be matched to verify the document's authenticity. Your freedom, your future, your daily life, all of it encoded in a torn piece of animal skin filed somewhere in a master's chest. There was a darker dimension to apprenticeship that the records occasionally illuminate, and it involves the masters who were not the good ones. Cases of severe mistreatment do appear in guild records, court documents, and town council minutes. Apprentices who ran away and were pursued, apprentices who appeared before magistrates with injuries that required some explanation, masters who were censured or occasionally expelled from guilds for conduct toward their charges that exceeded even the generous boundaries of acceptable correction. A quirky footnote in the history of English craft guilds involves a 14th century case in which a master smith was brought before guild authorities for, among other things, requiring his apprentice to sleep in the forge during winter to keep the fire alive through the night. Technically a form of 24-hour labor extraction dressed up as fire maintenance duty. The guild's response was measured, which tells you something about where the line was in practice versus where it was in theory. By the end of your 7 years, if you survived them, if you did not run away, if you did not anger your master badly enough to have your indenture terminated, and if you did not simply die of one of the numerous diseases that moved through medieval populations with casual efficiency, you emerged as a journeyman. You were now technically free to work for wages, to travel and work in other shops, to accumulate money and experience, and eventually, to present a masterwork to your guild, pay your fees, and be admitted as a master yourself. The masterwork was a test piece, a single item made to demonstrate that you had achieved the highest level of competence in your craft. For a blacksmith, this might be an ornate lock, a complex piece of decorative ironwork, or a technically demanding tool. It had to be made in front of guild examiners from scratch in a set time, so that there could be no question of outside help or prior preparation. If it passed, you were a master. If it did not pass, you tried again, after paying the examination fee again, which was not cheap. And the journeyman years between apprenticeship and mastership could themselves stretch into decades. Some journeymen never made master at all, either because they lacked the capital to establish a workshop, because the local guild had caps on the number of masters it would admit, or because the masterwork examination kept returning a politely devastating verdict. Historians still argue about the extent to which guild examination processes were used to limit competition rather than purely to ensure quality. The answer, human nature being what it is probably that it was both at once. You have survived your apprenticeship. You are, by any reasonable measure, a highly skilled craftsperson. You can read metal by its color, shape iron by feel and experience, produce objects of genuine utility and occasionally genuine beauty. You have given 7 years of your youth to this knowledge, and it lives in your hands and your eyes and your body in a way that no amount of reading could replicate. Your hands, incidentally, are already showing it. The calluses, the small burn scars, the slight thickening of the tendons in your striking arm from thousands upon thousands of hammer blows. You are perhaps 18 or 19 years old, and your body has already started keeping records. It is going to keep a great many more before this is over. Your body is a document. Every year you spend at the forge writes something new into it. A scar here, a deformity there, a gradual accumulation of damage that tells the story of your trade more honestly than any guild record or master's ledger ever could. If a physician, or more likely a barber surgeon, which is a medieval combination of professions that should give you pause, were to examine a smith who had worked his craft for 20 years, he would not need to ask what the man did for a living. The evidence would be immediate, comprehensive, and somewhat difficult to look at without wincing. Let us start with the most obvious thing, which is the arm. You strike with a hammer. You do this thousands of times per day, hundreds of thousands of times per year, millions of times over the course of a working life. The arm you use for this, your dominant arm, your hammer arm, becomes, over time, measurably different from your other arm. The muscles of the forearm, upper arm, and shoulder on your striking side hypertrophy, which is the polite medical word for growing disproportionately large in response to repeated stress. Medieval skeletons excavated from sites associated with craft occupations show exactly this kind of asymmetrical musculoskeletal development. And bioarchaeologists, people who study what bones can tell us about how their owners lived, can identify likely smiths from skeletal remains with a reasonable degree of confidence based on patterns of bone remodeling, muscle attachment sites, and stress markers. This sounds impressive from a historical distance. From your present tense position inside a living body, it means that your striking arm is noticeably larger than your other arm, that your shoulder on that side sits slightly lower from years of carrying tool weight, and that by your late 30s you have a persistent ache in that shoulder that never quite goes away, not even on rest days, and that worsens significantly in cold or damp weather. Medieval Europe, which includes large quantities of cold and damp weather, gives you ample opportunity to experience this worsening. Your hands deserve their own paragraph. The hands of a working blacksmith are extraordinary objects, thick, scarred, calloused to a degree that makes ordinary cuts and scrapes essentially irrelevant, with fingernails that are perpetually stained with carbon and iron oxide in the creases regardless of how thoroughly you clean them. The grip strength of an experienced smith is remarkable. You can hold workpieces steady against forces that would move most people entirely. But the price of this grip, accumulated over years, is a progressive stiffening of the finger joints, what we would now recognize as occupational osteoarthritis, that begins subtly and worsens steadily. By your 40s, your fingers do not close all the way in the morning without considerable coaxing. By your 50s, if you reach them, the first hour of every workday involves a quiet, private negotiation between your intentions and your hand's willingness to cooperate. Burns are so constant a feature of smithing life that they barely register as injuries after the first few years. You have been burned by sparks, by accidentally contacting hot metal, by reaching for something in a dark corner of the shop that turned out to be a cooling piece left where it should not have been, because a piece of iron at 300 degrees Celsius looks exactly like a piece of iron at room temperature, a fact that the craft teaches through painful and memorable demonstration. The accumulated burn scars on your forearms form a kind of topographic map of your working life. each one the remnant of a specific miscalculation or moment of inattention. You stopped noticing them being added somewhere around year 3 of your apprenticeship. They are simply the texture of your skin now. More serious than surface burns is the risk of what happens when things go genuinely wrong. Hot metal can splash, a phenomenon called fire scale explosion, where steam trapped in or near the workpiece expands suddenly and sends fragments of hot material in unpredictable directions. If this happens near your face, which it occasionally does, the results range from minor scarring to partial blindness, depending on the specifics. Eye injuries were a recognized occupational hazard of medieval smithing, and historians still argue whether smiths used any form of eye protection. There are references in some medieval craft texts to screens or shields used near the forge, but whether these were consistent practice or occasional improvisation is unclear. What is clear is that older smiths who had survived long careers showed evidence of eye damage at rates significantly higher than the general population, including cataracts accelerated by years of exposure to intense infrared radiation from the forge, a hazard that was not understood in medieval terms but that was very much a real and measurable phenomenon. You are also, every single working day, hitting yourself. Not intentionally, though the line between intentional hammer strikes and accidental ones is thinner than it might seem when you are tired and the hammer is heavy and the piece needs one more strike but your concentration slipped just slightly. Smiths hit their own hands, their own fingers, their own thighs when a piece moves unexpectedly. They develop bruises over older bruises, and the particularly vulnerable area is the thumb and forefinger of the hand that holds the tongs, the hand that is by necessity in relatively close proximity to the striking zone. Guild records and medical texts from the medieval period mention finger and hand injuries among smiths with a frequency that suggests this was considered an ordinary professional hazard rather than an exceptional misfortune. Losing a finger to a hammer blow, or to a piece of metal moving unexpectedly, or to an infection following a burn or cut, was not common enough to be considered inevitable but common enough that most experienced smiths knew someone it had happened to. Now let us go inside, because the external damage, while impressive, is only part of the story. Your lungs are suffering in ways you cannot see and would not have the vocabulary to describe accurately even if you could. The forge burns charcoal or coal, and both of these combustion processes produce a complex mixture of gases and particulates, including carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, particularly from coal, and a variety of fine particles and aerosols that, when inhaled repeatedly over years, cause progressive damage to lung tissue. The condition we now call pneumoconiosis, literally dusty lung, was not understood in medieval medical terms, but its effects were observable. Medieval smiths, miners, and other workers exposed to persistent smoke and dust showed elevated rates of chronic respiratory disease, and descriptions in medieval medical literature of the breathing sickness of craftsmen align reasonably well with what we now understand about occupational lung disease. The smithy's ventilation was minimal. The forge is inside. The smoke goes up through a hood or chimney, when the chimney is drawing properly, which is not always, and some percentage of it stays in the room, where you breathe it for 10 to 14 hours a day. You become accustomed to the taste and smell of smoke the way fish become accustomed to water, which is to say that you lose the ability to notice it, which does not stop it from damaging you. By your 30s you have a persistent cough, particularly bad in winter, when the shop is kept more tightly closed against the cold and ventilation worsens, that your contemporaries regard as an ordinary feature of the trade, a kind of professional affectation that marks you as a man of the forge, though it is actually your respiratory system staging a prolonged and losing protest. The carbon monoxide issue is subtler and more dangerous. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and produced whenever carbon-based fuels burn in conditions of insufficient oxygen, which in a poorly ventilated forge is a relatively frequent occurrence. Acute carbon monoxide poisoning causes headache, dizziness, nausea, and confusion, and in severe cases unconsciousness and death. But chronic low-level exposure, the kind that accumulates over years of working in a smoky enclosed space, causes subtler effects, persistent headaches, fatigue, cognitive dulling, that are easily attributed to the general demands of hard labor and therefore never identified as a distinct problem. You may have spent significant portions of your working life mildly carbon monoxide poisoned without either you or anyone around you recognizing it as such. This is one of those historical facts that is more uncomfortable the longer you sit with it. Your hearing deserves a section of its own, or at least a solid paragraph, because it is going to get worse and worse until it simply stops getting worse because there is nothing left to lose. The anvil is loud. This is not a subjective observation. The impact of a hammer on an iron anvil generates sound pressure levels that, measured in modern terms, regularly exceed 100 decibels, and sustained exposure to noise above 85 decibels causes permanent hearing damage over time. Medieval smiths had no ear protection, no understanding of noise-induced hearing loss as a mechanism, and no expectation that their hearing should survive their career intact. Presbycusis, age-related hearing loss, was well recognized in medieval medicine. Occupational noise-induced hearing loss was not distinguished from it, because nobody was asking the right questions. What this means for you practically is that by your middle years you have developed a persistent ringing in your ears, tinnitus, that is present when you work and present when you stop working and present when you try to sleep and present, as far as you can tell, always. You have learned to sleep through it the way people who live near train tracks learn to sleep through trains. It is not pleasant. It is not nothing. But it is yours, and you carry it the way you carry every other occupational debt, without ceremony, without complaint, because complaint would accomplish nothing, and because everyone around you who does the same work has the same ringing and would look at you blankly if you brought it up. There is a quirky footnote in the history of medieval occupational medicine, a genuine one, involving a 13th-century Italian physician named Teodorico Borgognoni, who wrote extensively about surgical practice and made observations about craftsmen's health that were remarkably systematic for his era. Among his notes are references to the deafness of those who work in noise, which suggests that at least some medieval medical thinkers were making the connection between occupational noise exposure and hearing loss, even without understanding the underlying physiology. Whether this observation ever translated into any practical protective measure for actual working smiths is, to put it gently, doubtful. Your spine is also registering its objections. The posture of smithing, hunched over the anvil, bent toward the forge, reaching across the workbench, is not one that the human back endorses for extended daily repetition. Lumbar strain, disc compression, and the progressive wear of the intervertebral discs are all occupational hazards of any trade that involves prolonged bending and heavy lifting, and smithing involves both in abundance. Skeletal analysis of medieval craft workers shows elevated rates of osteoarthritic changes in the lumbar vertebrae, the lower back, compared to agricultural workers and higher status individuals. You will feel this by your 30s as a background ache that becomes a foreground ache on heavy days. By your 40s, it is a defining feature of your existence. You adjust your working posture constantly, unconsciously, in ways that compensate for the pain while simultaneously introducing new stresses elsewhere, so that your body becomes a kind of elaborate, ongoing negotiation between different competing kinds of hurt. And then there is the heat stress. Working close to a forge that burns at over 1,000 degrees Celsius, in a small enclosed space, for the better part of every day, means that your core body temperature is elevated for most of your working life. The human body manages heat through sweating, vasodilation, and behavioral adaptation, and you do all of these things. You sweat copiously, you drink large amounts of ale and water when available, you take breaks in cooler spaces when you can. But sustained heat exposure at high levels causes cardiovascular strain, because the heart has to work harder to pump blood to the skin for cooling while simultaneously maintaining circulation for working muscles. Over years, this contributes to elevated cardiovascular risk, though medieval medical thought would never have framed it in these terms, and the smith who died of heart failure in his 50s would have been mourned as a man who simply wore out, which is accurate enough as a description if not as a diagnosis. A genuinely surprising fact about medieval smiths' occupational health involves their teeth. The combination of a diet often high in coarse bread, which acted as an abrasive, and the practice of using the mouth as an impromptu third hand when both actual hands were occupied with tongs and hammer meant that smiths' teeth showed distinctive wear patterns. More specifically, smiths were frequently documented holding nails, wire, small tools, or workpiece ends in their teeth temporarily during work, which introduced both mechanical stress and metal contamination to their dental enamel in ways that were, and this is the understatement of the medieval period, not dentally beneficial. Historians still argue whether this mouth tool practice was as universal as some accounts suggest, or whether it was more common in certain regions or periods, but skeletal evidence from craft-associated graves shows dental wear patterns consistent with exactly this kind of occupational use. This accumulating ledger of physical cost was not hidden or denied in medieval culture. It was simply accepted. The body was a tool and tools wore out. The smith who could no longer swing a hammer with his ruined shoulder was expected to find some adaptation. Lighter work, supervisory roles if his shop was large enough, teaching apprentices, or to manage with whatever physical capacity remained. There was no workers' compensation, no disability pension, no medical retirement. There was the work, and there was whatever condition you were in when you came to do it, and the gap between those two things was your problem to solve privately. You solve it the way medieval people solved most problems, by continuing. By getting up before dawn and feeding the forge and picking up the hammer and doing the thing again, because the alternative, the forge going cold, the clients going elsewhere, the guild losing patience, the rent going unpaid, is worse than the ache in your shoulder and the ringing in your ears and the cough that wakes you at 3 in the morning. You continue. The hammer rises and falls. The metal glows and is shaped. And the body keeps its records patiently in bone and scar and silent cellular damage, writing the autobiography of your trade in the only medium it has available. Let us talk about money, because money is the thing that makes all of the physical suffering either bearable or pointless, and in your case, the answer is complicated in ways that would make a modern accountant quietly weep into their spreadsheet. You are a skilled craftsperson. You perform a service that is genuinely essential to the functioning of medieval society. Without smiths, there are no tools, no weapons, no horseshoes, no plowshares, no locks, no hinges, no nails, no agricultural implements of any kind. The entire material infrastructure of medieval civilization passes through your forge at some point, directly or indirectly. You would think, given this centrality, that the economics of your trade would reward you accordingly. You would be wrong, and the specific mechanisms by which you are wrong are worth examining in some detail, because they are both historically fascinating and quietly infuriating. Start with the raw materials, because the raw materials are where your financial troubles begin before you have even lit the forge for the morning. Iron in the medieval period was not cheap, and it was not uniformly available, and the quality varied enormously depending on its source. Iron had to be smelted, converted from or to usable metal through a high-temperature reduction process before you could work it, and unless you were a very unusual smith operating your own bloomery furnace as well as a smithy, you were not doing the smelting yourself. You were buying iron from a merchant or ironmonger, which meant you were buying it at a marked-up price that reflected the cost of the ore, the fuel for the smelting, the labor of the smelter, the profit of whoever transported it, and the further profit of whoever sold it to you. By the time iron arrived at your anvil, it had already been through several sets of hands, each of which had taken their portion of its value. The iron you received was not always what you paid for. Medieval iron quality was inconsistent in ways that could ruin a working day or worse. Iron with unexpected impurities, phosphorus, sulfur, slag inclusions, behaved differently under the hammer and in the fire, sometimes catastrophically so. A piece of iron that looked perfectly acceptable in the merchant's yard might reveal its flaws only when you tried to work it, by cracking under the hammer, or by refusing to take a proper weld, or by producing a finished product that was visibly inferior to what the client expected. In these cases, you absorbed the cost, the wasted fuel, the wasted time, the ruined piece, and the need to start again with fresh material purchased from your own pocket. Coal or charcoal for the forge was another significant expense. Charcoal in particular was produced from managed woodland, and its supply was subject to seasonal variation, transportation costs, and the competing demands of other industries, glassmaking, pottery, brewing, that also required significant fuel inputs. The fuel cost of running a forge was not trivial, and it was essentially non-negotiable because a cold forge produced nothing. This meant that your operating costs were largely fixed regardless of how much work you actually had on a given day. Whether you had a full order book or a single commission, the charcoal still burned at roughly the same rate, and you paid for it either way. Now add the guild dues. Guild membership was, in most urban and many semi-urban contexts, mandatory for legally practicing your trade. Operating outside the guild was theoretically possible in some times and places. Traveling smiths, rural smiths in areas without guild coverage. But in any town or city with an established guild, an unlicensed smith risked fines, confiscation of tools, and official harassment from guild officers whose job partly consisted of identifying and suppressing unauthorized competition. So you paid your dues. The guild collected fees for membership, fees for examinations, fees for inspections, fees for the periodic feasts and civic obligations that were part of guild membership in ways that blurred the line between professional association and compulsory social club. These fees were not ruinous individually, but they accumulated, and they were owed regardless of how business was going, which meant that a slow season did not reduce your guild obligations. It simply added financial pressure to professional disappointment. There was also the matter of price controls, which operated differently in different times and places but were a recurring feature of medieval economic life in ways that directly constrained your ability to charge what the market might otherwise bear. Civic authorities, town councils, municipal magistrates, sometimes royal officials, periodically set maximum prices for essential goods and services, and ironwork fell into this category because iron tools and horseshoes and hardware were essential to so many people, and because price gouging by craftsmen was a persistent source of social complaint. When prices were controlled, your margin on each piece was fixed regardless of what your input costs were doing. If charcoal prices rose, and they did seasonally and in years of poor woodland management, your margin compressed automatically, and there was no legal mechanism for passing the increase on to your customers beyond what the controlled price allowed. Historians still argue about how consistently medieval price controls were enforced and how much practical effect they had on artisan income, given that informal negotiation and under-the-table arrangements were certainly part of how actual transactions worked. The most likely answer is that official price controls set a ceiling that constrained the most profitable transactions while allowing plenty of room for negotiation on complex, custom, or high-status work that did not fit neatly into the controlled categories. But this still meant that your bread-and-butter work, the routine nails, hinges, hooks, and horseshoes that formed the reliable core of your income, was priced in an environment where your bargaining power was limited by official intervention. The credit situation deserves careful attention because it shaped the daily texture of your economic life in ways that modern readers may not immediately appreciate. Medieval economies were credit economies to a significant degree, not credit in the modern sense of bank loans and interest rates, but credit in the sense of deferred payment, running accounts, and webs of mutual obligation that governed most commercial relationships. Your clients did not typically pay you in cash at the point of service. They paid you when they had money, which might be after the harvest or after a market day or after a debt they were owed came in, and this was a real and common scenario, not at all or not in full. You extended credit because you had to, because refusing credit to a client meant losing the client, and losing clients in a community where reputation and personal relationships governed commerce meant professional damage that was very difficult to repair. But extending credit meant carrying the cost of materials and labor out of your own pocket until payment arrived, which required you to have reserves, and building reserves was difficult when your income was irregular, your costs were constant, and your guild dues were due on schedule regardless of how your accounts receivable were performing. The barter dimension added further complexity. Payment in kind, in grain, in livestock, in goods rather than coin, was not unusual, particularly in rural areas and for clients who were themselves farmers or craftspeople rather than merchants. Accepting grain as payment for ironwork meant you had grain, which was useful, but it also meant you had to convert grain into the coin you needed for materials and dues, which meant engaging with grain markets and their own fluctuations, or finding merchants who would accept grain directly, which introduced another layer of negotiation and another set of haircuts on your purchasing power. Let us construct a rough picture of a working day's economics, imagining a moderately successful urban smith in, say, 13th century England, working in a town of several thousand people with a functioning guild and a reasonable client base. He might make a dozen horseshoes on a given day, each requiring material, fuel, and perhaps 20 minutes of skilled labor, and sell them at a price set partly by guild convention and partly by local custom. He might also take in a repair job, a broken plow iron brought by a farmer who will pay at harvest, a hinge for a merchant's warehouse that needs to be remade to a specific size, a set of nails for a carpenter who wants them by Friday. His gross income for the day, if everything is paid, is meaningful but not large. His material costs for the day, iron, charcoal, any specialized components, might represent 30 to 50% of that gross. His guild dues, amortized across working days, take another small percentage. What remains, before any allowance for tool maintenance, building costs if he rents his premises or domestic expenses, is his working income. It is not nothing. A skilled urban smith in the high medieval period earned significantly more than an agricultural laborer and more than most unskilled workers. He ate better, lived in better housing, and had more social status. But he was not wealthy. He was, by the standards of his society, comfortably positioned in the skilled artisan class, above the laboring poor, below the merchant elite, perpetually conscious of the costs that pressed in from all sides and the unpredictability of an income that depended on how many horses in the district needed shoes this week, and whether the lord of the manor had decided this was the year to upgrade his ironwork. A genuinely quirky dimension of the medieval iron economy involves the strategic value of scrap metal. Iron was never wasted. Old tools, worn-out horseshoes, broken implements of all kinds were collected, hoarded, and returned to the forge because the iron in them was as workable as new iron and considerably cheaper. A medieval smithy often had a corner dedicated to scrap accumulation, a pile of broken, worn, and discarded iron pieces awaiting reworking, and smiths actively sought and purchased scrap from the community. Farmers brought in broken plow parts. Households brought in damaged cooking implements. Soldiers and their dependents brought in damaged weapon and armor components. All of it was worth something, and the smith's ability to convert apparent waste into functional new objects was both economically valuable and, to contemporary observers, faintly miraculous in the same way that all of his fire and metal transformations seemed faintly miraculous. The financial precarity of the smithing trade was particularly acute during periods of broader economic disruption, and the medieval period, for all its apparent stability in retrospect, was punctuated by episodes of dramatic economic stress. The Black Death, which swept Europe from 1347 onward, killed somewhere between a third and half of the European population in its initial wave, and its economic effects were profound and contradictory. On one hand, the survivors inherited the assets and sometimes the workshops of the dead. On the other hand, entire client networks could collapse when a significant portion of the local population died within months, and supply chains for iron and fuel were disrupted by the deaths of the workers and transporters who maintained them. Individual smiths who survived the plague might find their circumstances dramatically improved or dramatically worsened depending on the specific pattern of mortality in their area and trade network. The seasons imposed their own financial rhythm. Winter was slower. Farmers had less need for agricultural implements when the fields were frozen. Travel was reduced, which meant fewer horseshoes worn out on muddy winter roads. Building projects slowed. The forge still needed fuel. The guild dues were still owed. The food still needed buying. Winter was the season when the economic cushion you had built during the productive months of spring, summer, and harvest either proved adequate or proved not to be, and the difference between those two outcomes was the difference between a merely difficult few months and a genuinely desperate few months. And through all of this, the irregular income, the fixed costs, the credit obligations, the price controls, the seasonal variation, the material quality problems, the guild fees, you kept working. You lit the forge in the dark before dawn. You pumped the bellows. You read the color of the metal and swung the hammer and produced the things that the world needed from you. You kept accounts in your head, or scratched in chalk on a slate, or entrusted to the memory of your wife who managed the household finances with a precision born of necessity. You were not poor, quite. You were not secure, ever. You were a skilled craftsman in a world that needed your skills and compensated you for them with enough to live on and not quite enough to stop worrying, which is, when you think about it, a position that would feel remarkably familiar to a great many people in a great many centuries. The money never quite added up to comfort, but it added up to continuation, and for a medieval blacksmith, continuation was the closest thing to success that the economics of the trade reliably permitted. The guild is watching you. This is not paranoia. It is simply the operating reality of your professional life, and the sooner you make peace with it, the smoother things will go. The guild officer who walked past your shop this morning and paused to glance through the open door was not making a social call. He was observing. He was noting whether your work met standards, whether your setup was compliant, whether you were operating within the boundaries of what your guild membership permitted you to do. He may have said good morning with perfect friendliness. He was still, in every meaningful sense, inspecting you, and the inspection never really stops. The guild system is one of the most debated institutions in medieval economic history, and it deserves that debate because it was genuinely complicated, a structure that provided real benefits and imposed real constraints simultaneously, and whose net effect on the people inside it depended enormously on which aspect of it was most active in your particular life at any given moment. If you were a master smith in good standing with a healthy workshop and good client relationships, the guild was largely a positive presence, a source of professional legitimacy, market protection, dispute resolution, and social belonging. If you were a journeyman struggling to accumulate the capital needed to establish yourself, or a master who had fallen behind on dues during a slow season, or someone who had made an enemy of the wrong guild official, the guild could feel like a boot on your neck wearing the very reasonable-looking shoe of professional regulation. Let us begin with what the guild actually was, structurally, because the word gets used as though it describes a single unified thing when it actually describes an enormous variety of organizations across different times, places, and trades. The guild, known variously as a guild, confraternita, zunft, métier, or company depending on your European location, was at its core a voluntary association of practitioners of a given craft, organized to regulate the trade, maintain standards, protect members from outside competition, and provide mutual support. Blacksmiths' guilds existed across Europe from roughly the 12th century onward, though the precise timing and form varied considerably by region. In some cities, ironworkers were organized into a single broad guild covering all metal trades. In others, the trades were subdivided: bladesmiths, armorers, nailers, and general blacksmiths, each having their own organization with their own rules and their own officers. The guild's authority over your working life was comprehensive in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective, where the closest analogies, professional licensing boards, trade unions, industry associations, each capture only one dimension of what the medieval guild was. The guild set the standards for acceptable work. It controlled who could practice the trade legally. It regulated the number of apprentices a master could take. It set guidelines for wages paid to journeymen. It mediated disputes between members and clients, and between members and other guilds when jurisdictional questions arose, and jurisdictional questions arose constantly, because the boundaries between related trades were contested and economically significant. Consider the boundary question for a moment, because it was a source of genuine, sometimes bitter conflict. A blacksmith worked iron, a cutler worked blades, an armorer worked plate metal for defensive equipment, a locksmith worked locks, a spurrier worked spurs. These trades overlapped at their edges in ways that created perpetual argument about who had the right to make what. If a blacksmith made a knife as part of a larger commission, say a set of agricultural tools that included a small blade, was he trespassing on the cutler's territory? If he made a simple hook for hanging armor, was he infringing on the armorers? These questions were not trivial because guild monopolies over specific products were economically valuable, and enforcing those monopolies was part of what guild membership was supposed to provide. The guild enforced its boundaries partly through periodic inspections of members' workshops and partly through a system of informers, fellow guild members who were expected to report violations by their neighbors, which created an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that was simultaneously a quality control mechanism and a tool of competitive suppression. If your neighbor smith was producing work below guild standards, reporting him was a professional duty. If your neighbor smith was producing work of excellent quality but slightly outside his technical jurisdiction, reporting him was also technically a professional duty, though the motivations were somewhat different. Historians still argue about the extent to which guild inspection systems were genuinely oriented toward quality maintenance versus being deployed primarily as competitive weapons by established masters against rivals, and the answer is almost certainly both, in proportions that varied by personality, circumstance, and the specific stakes involved. The guild feast deserves a mention because it illustrates the social dimension of the institution that sits awkwardly alongside its regulatory functions. Guilds held regular communal meals, feast days associated with their patron saint, quarterly or annual gatherings that combined business with eating and drinking. For the Blacksmiths' Guild, the patron saint in much of medieval Europe was Saint Eligius, also known as Saint Aloy, a 7th century Frankish bishop who had been a goldsmith and metalworker before his religious career and who was adopted as the patron of all metal workers. The feast of Saint Eligius was a significant date in the smith's calendar, a day of rest from the forge, of communal eating, of the particular social bonding that happens when people who work in the same difficult trade spend time together outside the demands of that trade. These feasts were not optional. Attendance was expected. Your contribution to the feast, whether in food, in coin, or in kind, was part of your guild obligation. Missing the feast without acceptable excuse was noted. Failing to contribute appropriately was noted. The social infrastructure of the guild was also, in this way, a monitoring system, and the man who did not appear at the St. Eligius feast and offered no satisfactory explanation was a man whose standing in the guild had just quietly declined. The guild also functioned as a mutual aid society, which was one of its genuinely beneficial dimensions. If a member smith was ill or injured and could not work, the guild, in theory and in practice with variable reliability, was supposed to provide support. If a member died, the guild was supposed to contribute to funeral costs and provide some assistance to the widow and children. If a member's workshop burned down, a not uncommon hazard given the industry involved, the guild community was expected to help with rebuilding. This mutual support function was real and meaningful, particularly for smiths who lacked the family networks or personal wealth to weather disasters independently. But the mutual aid came with strings, as it always does. Your claim on guild support was only as good as your standing in the guild, which meant your history of dues payment, your compliance with regulations, your attendance at meetings and feasts, your relationships with influential members. A smith who had been in good standing for 20 years could expect robust support in a crisis. A smith who had been a difficult member, who had disputes on record, who was behind on dues or had been cited for violations, might find that the guild's generosity was somehow less available when he needed it most. This was not always explicit. The guild did not formally say that assistance was contingent on popularity, but the informal reality of how human institutions work meant that your investment in the social relationships of the guild was an investment in your safety net. The journeyman's position within the guild system deserves particular attention, because it was in many ways the most difficult position to occupy. As a journeyman, you were fully trained, fully qualified, and fully subordinate. You could not take your own clients. You could not train apprentices. You could not use the guild's quality mark on your work. That mark belonged to the master in whose shop you worked. You were essentially a highly skilled laborer whose skills were largely invisible to the outside world, because the credit for the work went to the master and the master's reputation. You earned wages rather than business income, which meant you were on the wrong side of the economic leverage equation, and the wages you earned were regulated by the guild, which is to say, by the masters who controlled the guild, at levels that were sufficient for subsistence but designed not to accumulate into the capital you needed to become a master yourself. This was not an accident. The masters who ran the guild had a structural interest in keeping journeyman wages low enough that the transition from journeyman to master remained slow and difficult. Every new master was, in some sense, a new competitor, and while the guild officially encouraged the advancement of qualified journeymen, the practical mechanisms through which advancement happened, the masterwork examination, the shop establishment fee, the requirement to purchase guild mastership were all controlled by the existing masters and were all, conveniently, expensive. A quirky but revealing detail from the records of several European guilds involves the periodic complaints filed by journeymen against masters for artificially inflating examination fees or delaying the scheduling of masterwork assessments. Complaints that illuminate the tension between the guilds. Official commitment to craft progression and the economic incentives of those in power within it. In some cities, journeymen formed their own parallel organizations, journeymen's associations or companions, that functioned as a kind of guild within a guild, providing mutual support, coordinating collective bargaining with masters over wages, and maintaining networks of information about which masters were good employers and which were exploitative. These organizations were viewed with deep suspicion by master guilds and city authorities, who recognized them correctly as nascent labor organizations and treated them accordingly, which is to say, with attempts at suppression that were partially successful and partially not, because the economic interests of journeymen were real and persistent and did not disappear simply because the authorities disapproved of organized advocacy. The guild's relationship with civic authority was another layer of complexity. In most medieval towns and cities, guilds operated under charters granted by municipal authorities or occasionally by royal decree, which gave them their monopoly rights and their regulatory powers but also made them answerable to the civic order. The town council could revoke or modify a guild's charter. The lord or king could impose obligations on the guild, forced labor, military supply, special taxes, that the guild had to absorb and distribute among its members. The guild was thus simultaneously a source of protection for its members and a transmission mechanism for external demands that its members had little power to resist. The guild inspectors also checked your weights and measures. Medieval commerce relied on standard units of weight and measure, and the enforcement of those standards was a guild responsibility as well as a civic one. If you were selling iron by weight, which was relevant when dealing in scrap or in raw material, your scales had to be accurate and they were subject to inspection. If your weights were found to be off, the interpretation was not generous. A scale that slightly underweighed purchases from you was fraud, and guild penalties for fraud were significant: fines, public shaming, suspension of trading rights, and in serious cases expulsion from the guild, which was effectively a professional death sentence in a guild-controlled trade. The documentation burden of guild membership was real, though variable by era and location. Keeping records of apprentices taken, journeymen employed, commissions completed, materials purchased, all of this created a paper trail that the guild could audit and that you were expected to maintain. In an age of general low literacy, this documentation burden fell on those who could write or required you to employ someone who could, adding another small cost to the overhead of professional compliance. And through all of this regulatory infrastructure, the inspections, the dues, the feast obligations, the journeyman wages, the masterwork examinations, the quality marks, the border disputes with adjacent trades, the audit requirements, the patron saint's day attendance, the guild also provided you with something genuinely valuable and not easily dismissed: identity. You were not simply a man who heated metal and hit it with a hammer. You were a member of the Smiths Guild of this town, in good standing, with the rights and recognitions that entailed. You had a professional community that recognized your competence and your membership. You had a collective voice in civic life that individual craftsmen lacked. You had, in the language of the time, an estate, a recognized position in the social order, and that recognition mattered in a world where your place in the social hierarchy determined almost everything about how you were treated and what you could expect. The guild was your professional family, which meant it was demanding and occasionally infuriating and sometimes deeply unfair, and also that it was yours, and that without it you were alone in ways that the medieval world made genuinely dangerous. You paid your dues. You attended the feast. You nodded respectfully when the inspector walked past. And you went back to the forge because the guild could regulate everything about your professional life except the fundamental act at its center, which was the work itself, the fire and the metal and the hammer and the thing you made that was not there before, that, at least, was entirely yours. You are hungry. This is not a dramatic statement. It is simply the baseline condition of most of your waking hours, a persistent background signal that you have learned to manage rather than satisfy, the way you have learned to manage the ringing in your ears and the ache in your shoulder. Hunger in the medieval world was not the acute emergency it would represent to a modern person who has never missed more than one meal voluntarily. It was the weather of daily existence, sometimes mild, sometimes severe, always present in some form, and entirely indifferent to your schedule or your preferences. Your diet, broadly speaking, is built around bread. Not the soft, pillowy, uniformly textured bread of the modern bakery, but a dense, dark, chewy loaf made from whatever grain was locally available and affordable: rye, barley, oats, or a mixture called maslin that combined wheat with cheaper grains to stretch the yield. Wheat bread, the white kind, was for people with more money than you. Your bread was darker, denser, and considerably more abrasive to the teeth, which, as you may recall from the dental discussion earlier in your story, was a feature of your diet that your teeth were experiencing as a slow-motion catastrophe. The bread was baked communally in many towns. You paid a baker to use their oven, or brought your own dough to a shared facility, or in a clay oven attached to wealthier households. It was, when fresh, reasonably satisfying. When stale, which it often was by the third or fourth day, it was best deployed as a platform for wetter foods, sopped in broth or ale or whatever liquid was available to make it chewable again. The centerpiece of your daily eating beyond bread was pottage, which was essentially a catch-all term for thick soup or stew made in a pot over the hearth and containing whatever was available and affordable. On good days, pottage contained legumes, peas, beans, lentils, which provided protein and were relatively cheap and storable. It might contain vegetables: onions, leeks, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, all of which were grown in kitchen gardens or purchased cheaply at market. On better days, it might contain a small amount of meat, salt pork, a chicken too old to lay, offal which was cheap because it was the parts that wealthier people did not want, floating in the broth in quantities that flavored the stew without really qualifying as a meat meal in any satisfying modern sense. On worse days, pottage was primarily a vehicle for grain, thickened with oatmeal or barley, flavored with whatever herbs were growing outside the door, nourishing in the minimal sense of providing calories without providing much pleasure. Meat in more substantial quantities was a periodic luxury rather than a daily expectation. The medieval church's fasting calendar, which prohibited meat consumption on Fridays, Saturdays, the entirety of Lent, and various other feast days and vigils, meant that somewhere between a third and a half of all days in the year were officially meat-free, regardless of whether you could afford meat on the other days. On fish days, as the meatless days were called, you ate fish if you could get it and afford it, which in an inland location meant preserved fish, salted herring, dried cod, stockfish that had been air-dried into planks of preserved protein requiring extensive soaking and cooking to become edible. Fresh fish was available in coastal areas and river towns. Everywhere else, fish days meant preserved fish, which had an assertive smell and a demanding texture and which you ate because the church said so and because the alternative was breaking a religious rule with consequences you preferred not to contemplate. Ale, as established, was your primary drinking fluid, and it was produced domestically, often by your wife or by an alewife in the neighborhood, from malted grain fermented with water. The flavor was nothing like modern beer. It was yeasty, slightly sour, often murky, and varied enormously in quality and strength from batch to batch and producer to producer. It was drunk in large quantities throughout the day, with meals during work breaks in the evening because it was safe, because it was caloric, and because it was simply what people drank. Water was drunk when nothing else was available, not as a preference. Wine was for people significantly wealthier than you, available in towns near wine-producing regions or through merchants at prices that placed it firmly outside your regular budget. Seasonal variation shaped your diet in ways that are difficult to appreciate from the perspective of a modern food system that makes strawberries available in December and root vegetables available in June. Your eating in summer was richer, more varied, and more vegetable-forward as kitchen gardens and market gardens produced their seasonal abundance. Your eating in winter narrowed dramatically to what could be stored: root vegetables in underground cellars, dried legumes, preserved meat and fish, hard cheeses, dried fruit for those who could afford it. The weeks before the spring planting and the new season's production, roughly February through April in Northern Europe, were traditionally the hungriest time of year, when last autumn stores were running low and this year's growth had not yet arrived. This period was called, with admirable honesty, the hungry gap, and for people at the lower end of the economic scale it could shade from uncomfortable scarcity into genuine malnutrition. As a smith, you were not at the lowest end of the economic scale, which offered some protection against the worst of the hungry gap. Your income, while not generous, was generally sufficient to maintain better-than-subsistence nutrition. You could afford to buy stored food when your own supplies ran low, and your status in the community meant that you had social credit with merchants and food producers that could be extended into times of shortage. But you were not so comfortably positioned that food insecurity was entirely theoretical, particularly in years of poor harvest, which in medieval Europe came with a regularity that made agricultural failure a recurring rather than exceptional feature of life. The harvest failure issue deserves a moment's attention, because it was genuinely catastrophic in ways that ripple through everything else. Medieval agriculture was vulnerable to weather in ways that modern industrial agriculture, with its irrigation systems and fertilizers and disease-resistant cultivars, largely is not. A wet spring that prevented plowing, a dry summer that stunted grain growth, an early autumn frost that killed crops before harvest. Any of these could reduce a region's food supply by a significant fraction, and medieval Europe periodically experienced combinations of bad weather that produced multi-year famines. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed an estimated 10 to 15% of the population of Northern Europe through starvation and the disease outbreaks that accompany nutritional collapse. During those years, a blacksmith's income provided relatively little protection, because when food is simply not available in sufficient quantities, money cannot buy what does not exist. Now let us talk about what was eating you, because the medieval world was not a passive backdrop to your hunger. It was actively interested in your body as a food source, and its interest was expressed through a remarkable variety of parasites and pathogens that shared your daily life with a comfort and familiarity that was entirely one-sided. Intestinal parasites were a near-universal feature of medieval life across all social classes. roundworm, Ascaris lumbricoides, whipworm, hookworm, and various species of tapeworm all made regular appearances in the human gut in medieval Europe, transmitted through contaminated food and water, through contact with animal feces in agricultural settings, and through the consumption of undercooked meat containing larval stages of the parasite's life cycles. Archaeological analysis of medieval latrines, a field that is exactly as glamorous as it sounds, has found parasite eggs in quantities that indicate infection rates approaching universal in some populations. You almost certainly had intestinal parasites for significant portions of your life, and unless they reached levels that caused acute symptoms, you would not have known it in any meaningful diagnostic sense. You might have noticed occasional abdominal discomfort, or a persistent sense of not quite getting enough nutrition from what you ate, or cycles of mild lethargy that you attributed to overwork. The parasites eating a fraction of your calories and nutrient intake were invisible contributors to the ambient physical difficulty of your existence. Fleas and lice were such constant companions that medieval literature and medical texts addressed them as ordinary features of life requiring management rather than elimination. Your sleeping pallet, your clothing, your hair, and the hair of every animal in your vicinity hosted populations of ectoparasites that you could control, partially, through regular washing, combing, and the application of various herbal preparations. Pennyroyal was widely used as a flea repellent, and fine-toothed combs were a standard hygiene implement for managing lice, but that you could not eliminate with the resources available to you. The flea, beyond its inherent unpleasantness, was the vector for bubonic plague, the bacterium Yersinia pestis transmitted through flea bites from infected rats, which transformed it from a minor nuisance into one of the most consequential animals in human history. But even in non-plague years, fleas and lice caused skin irritation, interrupted sleep, and contributed to the low-grade immune activation that characterized medieval life and that had its own metabolic costs. The water situation created specific health hazards that interacted with your trade in interesting ways. The smithy required water for the slack tub, for drinking, for general workshop use, and this water came from whatever source was locally available. A well, a stream, a municipal conduit. The quality of that water varied from place to place and season to season, and its relationship to the latrines and middens and animal yards of the surrounding community was frequently and uncomfortably close. Waterborne diseases, dysentery, typhoid, various diarrheal illnesses caused by bacterial contamination were a regular feature of medieval life, appearing in seasonal patterns that reflected the contamination cycles of local water sources. Summer, when organic matter decomposed quickly and contamination spread easily, was typically the worst season for waterborne illness, which had the cruel logic of timing its worst effects for the season when you had the most work and could least afford to be incapacitated. The forge created its own specific disease environment beyond the lung damage already discussed. The burns that were an ordinary feature of smithing work were infection risks in a world without antibiotics and with a limited understanding of wound management. A burn that in the modern world would be treated with antiseptic cream and a bandage was in your world a potential portal for bacterial infection, particularly streptococcal and staphylococcal bacteria that cause the spreading skin infections collectively called erysipelas or, in more severe cases, progressed to sepsis, which was essentially invariably fatal. Medieval wound management involved the application of various preparations. Honey was used widely and actually has genuine antimicrobial properties. Various herbal poultices of varying effectiveness, cauterization with hot metal, which had a certain terrible irony given that hot metal had caused the wound in the first place. But the outcomes depended heavily on the severity of the wound, the virulence of any infecting organisms, and the patient's immune status, which in a malnourished, parasite-burdened, chronically smoke-exposed individual was not at its theoretical optimum. A genuinely surprising historical footnote involves the relationship between blacksmiths and local medical practice. In many medieval communities, the smith's skills, his fire, his metal, his knowledge of heating and shaping materials, made him a de facto resource for certain medical procedures that crossed the line between craft and healthcare. Cauterization of wounds, the straightening of bent limbs using heated metal splints, the fabrication of prosthetic devices and surgical implements. All of these drew on skills the smith possessed and that the local barber surgeon might not. Medieval surgical texts occasionally reference the collaboration between surgeons and smiths in the fabrication of instruments, and the boundary between medical metalwork and craft metalwork was porous in ways that put smiths in proximity to illness and injury at a frequency beyond what their own occupational hazards already ensured. Your wife managed the household food supply, and this was not a minor administrative task but a skilled economic endeavor requiring constant attention and considerable expertise. She knew which market stalls had the best prices on dried legumes. She knew which neighbors had surplus eggs to trade. She knew how to stretch a small amount of salt pork across a week of pottage without losing the flavor entirely. She knew how to judge the quality of grain before buying it, how to store it to minimize loss to mold and rodents, and how to manage the household's food consumption across the hungry gap without running out before spring's abundance arrived. This knowledge was real, was valuable, and was the difference between your household eating adequately through the winter and not. The food you ate fueled the work you did, imperfectly and chronically insufficiently. The calories in your daily bread and pottage powered the hammer swings and the bellows pumping and the carrying and the lifting, and they did so at a level that left you with essentially no reserve, no excess energy stored, no buffer against additional demand. On heavy work days, you burned more than you consumed, and the deficit accumulated in your body as fatigue that sleep partially addressed and that the next morning's meal partially replenished. You were, in the language of modern nutritional science, chronically in a marginal energy balance, functional, capable, but always operating close to the edge of what your fuel supply could support. And yet you ate, and the food sustained you, and you rose each morning and returned to the forge, and the fire was fed and the metal was heated and the hammer rose and fell in its ancient rhythm, and the day's work was done, and you slept the sleep of genuine exhaustion on your straw pallet, surrounded by the invisible company of fleas and lice and intestinal residents, and you woke before dawn and began again. The body endures what it must, and yours, apparently, must endure quite a lot. There is something about you that your neighbors cannot quite decide how to feel about. You are useful, indispensably, obviously, concretely useful in a way that very few people in the medieval world can claim without qualification. The priest is useful for your soul. The physician is useful for your body, theoretically. The Lord is useful for your protection, allegedly. But you are useful for everything that anyone touches, holds, uses, or depends upon in the material world. And yet, despite this usefulness, or perhaps because of it, you occupy a strange position in the social and spiritual imagination of your community, a position that is simultaneously elevated and suspect, revered and slightly feared, associated with divine craft and with something older and darker that the church has complicated opinions about. The folklore surrounding the blacksmith is ancient, widespread, and remarkably consistent across cultures that had no direct contact with each other, which tells you something important about how deeply the figure of the smith is embedded in human symbolic thinking. In Norse mythology, the master craftsman of the gods is Valendr, Wayland in the English tradition, a smith of supernatural skill whose story involves captivity, revenge, and flight on wings. He forged himself, a narrative that combines the smith's creative power with a darkness that the tradition does not attempt to soften. In Greek mythology, Hephaestus is the divine smith, the maker of the gods' weapons and armor, himself lame and ugly and somewhat socially marginal even among the Olympians, brilliant, essential, and not entirely comfortable to be around. In Celtic traditions, Goibniu, the smith god, was one of the three divine craftsmen whose skills sustained the supernatural order. Across West African traditions, the blacksmith occupied a position of ritual power and social ambivalence, simultaneously a specialist of great importance and a person set apart from ordinary social intercourse by the transformative nature of his work. The Christian medieval world inherited this ambivalence and layered its own theology over it without entirely resolving the underlying tension. On one hand, the Church celebrated craft as a participation in God's creative act, the idea, drawn from patristic theology, that the craftsman who made useful things from raw materials was imitating the divine creativity in a legitimate and praiseworthy way. The smith who turned crude ore into a plow that fed people, or a bell that called them to prayer, was doing God's work in the most literal operational sense. Saint Eligius, your patron, was held up as a model of exactly this synthesis. A man whose extraordinary craft skill was understood as a God-given gift, deployed in service of both the practical and the sacred, who had gone on to become a bishop and a saint and whose legend included several miracles that were, conveniently, craft-related. In one popular version of his legend, Eligius, faced with a horse that refused to be shod, detached the horse's leg, shod the hoof calmly, and reattached the leg, which is either a miracle or a description of a very unusual veterinary procedure, depending on how literally you take your hagiography. The church's celebration of your craft had very tangible expression in the objects you made for ecclesiastical use. Church ironwork was among the most prestigious and demanding work in a medieval smith's repertoire. The great hinges and locks for cathedral doors, the iron grills and screens that defined sacred spaces within churches, the candelabras and lamp holders and processional implements that furnished the liturgical environment. These objects were made to last centuries, and many of them did, which is why medieval ecclesiastical ironwork survives in European churches in quantities that allow modern historians and art historians to assess its quality and variety. The smith who made church ironwork was working in a context that gave his trade a spiritual legitimacy that ordinary commercial work could not provide. He was literally furnishing the house of God, which positioned his fire and metal transformations as sacred rather than suspect. And yet, the fire, the darkness, the transformation of raw matter into something new through processes that most people did not understand and could not replicate. The physical marking that distinguished you from your neighbors. The burns, the hammer arm, the coal-stained hands. The forge's light in the night, visible through the smithy door, flickering with an energy that looked nothing like a hearth fire and everything like something more primordial. These things fed a persistent thread of folklore that associated the blacksmith not with divine craft but with older powers, with the supernatural, with the fairy world, with figures that the Christian order had officially classified as either demonic or fictitious, but that the popular imagination stubbornly continued to take seriously. Iron itself was at the center of a profound magical ambivalence that ran through medieval European folklore with remarkable consistency. Iron was protective. Hanging an iron horseshoe above a door kept malevolent supernatural forces out, because fairies and demons and the evil eye were all supposed to be repelled by iron, a belief so widespread that it appears in folklore collections from Scotland to Sicily to Scandinavia. The smith who made iron objects was therefore, in some sense, a maker of protection, a craftsman of spiritual defense. But iron was also dangerous in the wrong hands, and the wrong hands included certain supernatural beings who might desire iron for their own purposes. Smiths in fairy tales and folk legends were frequently approached by non-human clients with commissions that had complicated consequences, and the wise smith in these stories was the one who knew how to complete the work without becoming entangled in the supernatural obligations that came with it. The horseshoe above the door is worth pausing on, because it is one of those cultural survivals that persisted long past the medieval period and is still vaguely familiar in the modern world. People hang horseshoes for luck without necessarily remembering why, which is a perfect example of how folk beliefs outlast their original context while losing their specific meaning. In the medieval world, the horseshoe's protective power was not vague or general. It was specific, iron, shaped by fire, marked by the smith's hammer, and previously attached to a living animal, combined multiple layers of protective symbolism in a single object. The debate about which direction the horseshoe should hang, open end up to hold the luck in or open end down to let the luck pour out, was already present in the medieval period, which means that people have been arguing about horseshoe orientation for at least 700 years, which is either charming or exhausting depending on your disposition. The connection between smiths and the supernatural was reinforced by a quirky metallurgical reality that medieval people observed without being able to explain. Certain iron objects, when heated and quenched in particular ways, acquired magnetic properties. A smith who discovered that a piece of iron he had worked attracted other pieces of iron was encountering the phenomenon of induced magnetism, a real and explicable physical effect. But in a medieval context, metal that reached out and pulled other metal toward it without visible force was, quite reasonably, interpreted as evidence of something beyond ordinary physics. The magnetic iron became another data point in the cultural file on smiths as people who worked with forces that exceeded ordinary human understanding. Historians still argue about the degree to which medieval smiths themselves believed in, manipulated, or were victimized by the supernatural reputation of their trade. The most sophisticated smiths, particularly those in urban environments with access to written technical traditions, probably understood their craft in relatively practical terms and were aware that the mystical reputation was partly a social construction. But belief and its performance are not always the same thing, and a smith who privately took a skeptical view of fairy tales might still hang an iron horseshoe above his door and make certain gestures and say certain words at the start of a delicate commission. Because these practices cost nothing, and the downside of ignoring them, in a world where bad luck was real, unpredictable, and sometimes catastrophic, was not obviously worth risking. The smith's relationship with fire had its own theological dimension beyond the general craft as divine creativity argument. Fire in Christian theology was richly ambiguous. The Holy Spirit descended as tongues of flame, but hell was also a place of fire, and the equation of uncontrolled fire with divine punishment was deeply embedded in the religious imagination. The smith who commanded fire for productive purposes was navigating a symbolic space that touched both the divine and the infernal, and this navigation left room for popular imagination to position the smith uncomfortably close to hellish associations. The forge in some folk traditions was a place the devil visited, not necessarily because the smith had made a diabolical bargain, but because fire was the devil's natural element and the forge was fire's most concentrated human expression. Stories of smiths outwitting the devil at his own game appear across European folklore with a frequency that suggests the association between smiths and diabolical encounters was firmly established in popular culture by the High Medieval period. One of the most widespread of these stories, appearing in versions across England, France, Germany, Scandinavia, and the Slavic world, involves a smith who makes a bargain with the devil or a devil-like figure, receives supernatural assistance with his craft in exchange for his soul, and then outsmarts the supernatural party through craft-related cleverness when the bill comes due. The precise mechanism of the escape varies by tradition. Sometimes the smith traps the devil in a bewitched container or chair or tree. Sometimes he produces an impossible piece of work that fulfills the letter of the agreement while defeating its spirit. But the consistent element is the smith's practical ingenuity triumphing over supernatural cunning. This is a flattering folk portrait, obviously, the smith as the clever craftsman who can beat the devil at his own game, but it also reveals the anxiety underlying the flattery, because you only tell stories about outwitting the devil if the devil's presence in your professional life feels real enough to require narrative management. The church attempted, with partial success, to redirect these folk associations toward more orthodox channels. The story of St. Dunstan, a 10th-century Archbishop of Canterbury who had been a skilled metalworker before his ecclesiastical career, provided an English parallel to the Eligius legend, and Dunstan's most famous miracle involved grabbing the devil by the nose with a pair of red-hot tongs when the devil appeared at his smithy door in disguise. This story is so perfectly calibrated to address the Smith-devil folk tradition that it is difficult not to read it as a deliberate ecclesiastical intervention in popular belief, a way of taking the existing narrative of the Smith-devil encounter and giving it an orthodox resolution in which the churchman-smith triumphs through faith and craft combined, rather than through the morally ambiguous cleverness of the secular folk versions. Your own relationship with these beliefs was probably pragmatic. You prayed to Saint Eligius at the start of important commissions. You observed the church calendar's fasting requirements. You attended Mass with the regularity that your social position demanded and your genuine faith, whatever its specific character, encouraged. And you also probably knew which words your grandfather said when starting a fire that had gone wrong, and you said them too sometimes, not because you were certain they worked, but because not saying them felt like an unnecessary risk. The medieval religious world was not a clean divide between official church doctrine and popular superstition. It was a layered, negotiated, somewhat inconsistent blend of both, and most people inhabited this blend with a comfort that modern categories of belief and unbelief do not easily accommodate. There was one specific area where the Smiths' supernatural associations created genuinely practical social complications, and that was the matter of weapon making. You made weapons, knives, blades, spear points, arrowheads, sword components, as a normal part of your trade. These were legal, commercial, useful objects, and their production was unambiguously legitimate in economic and civic terms. But weapons killed people, and the moral theology of killing was a live question in medieval Christian thought, and the smith who made the weapon that killed someone was, in certain theological frameworks, at least partially implicated in that death. Church authorities periodically addressed this question. Was the swordmaker morally responsible for the sword's use? And the general answer was no, or at least not primarily, but the question itself indicates that the association between smithcraft and violence was present in theological as well as folk thinking. The smith's fire never went entirely cold in the popular imagination, never quite lost its suggestion of older powers and darker transformations. You were the person who changed things, who took one form of matter and made it into another, who commanded heat that no ordinary person could approach, who produced objects of both beauty and lethality with the same hands and the same fire. This made you necessary, and it made you slightly uncanny, and the community that depended on you absolutely was also the community that hung iron above its doors, partly to keep things like you, or things associated with you, at a comfortable distance. You lit the forge each morning under the same sky as everyone else, and you said your prayers to the same God, and you paid your guild dues and ate your pottage and put one foot in front of the other through days that were hard and noisy and hot. But in the flicker of the forge light, in the color shift of glowing iron, in the particular silence that sometimes descended in the smithy between hammer strikes when the only sound was the breathing of the fire, in those moments you could feel why people told the stories they told about you. You were not quite like everyone else. You knew it. They knew it. And somehow, in the strange social contract of the medieval world, that knowing was both your burden and your distinction. The messenger arrives on a Tuesday, which is already a bad sign because nothing good in your experience has ever arrived on a Tuesday, and this messenger in particular is wearing the livery of the lord of the local manor, which elevates the situation from merely inconvenient to potentially life-altering in ways you have not yet had time to assess. He does not knock. The smithy door is open, as it always is during working hours, because keeping it closed would turn the interior into something approximating a bread oven with you as the bread. He simply appears in the doorway, lets his eyes adjust to the forge-lit dimness, locates you at the anvil, and delivers his message with the particular combination of authority and studied indifference that servants of powerful people learn early and deploy constantly. The Lord requires ironwork. Specifically, the Lord requires ironwork immediately, in quantities that your current order book cannot accommodate without pushing every other client's work backward by at least 2 weeks, and at a price that the messenger presents not as a negotiation opener but as a statement of fact. You will do this work. You will do it on this timeline. The price is what it is. The messenger waits for your acknowledgement, receives it, and leaves, and you stand at your anvil for a moment in the particular kind of silence that follows the arrival of an obligation you did not choose and cannot refuse. This is the reality of living and working in a world organized around feudal obligation and aristocratic power, and it is a reality that intersects with your trade in specific, recurring, and deeply inconvenient ways. The Lord, whether a minor knight, a baron, a bishop with temporal authority, or a representative of royal power, occupied a position in the medieval social order that gave him claims on your labor and your production that were not framed as requests. They were framed as requirements. The theoretical framework of feudal society held that the Lord provided protection and justice to those living under his authority, and that those people provided in return various forms of service and render: agricultural labor, military obligation for those of appropriate status, and the products of whatever craft or trade they practiced. For a blacksmith, this meant that when the Lord needed ironwork, the blacksmith provided ironwork, and the extent to which this was fairly compensated depended almost entirely on the character and conscience of the specific Lord, which varied enormously and was not something you had any mechanism for influencing. The demands that lords placed on local smiths ranged from the routine to the extraordinary, and the extraordinary ones were the ones that could genuinely break a small workshop. Routine demands included maintenance of the lord's agricultural equipment: plowshares, harrows, carts, the various iron fittings of farm buildings and storage structures, and the shoeing of the lord's horses, which in a large manner might number in the dozens. These were ongoing obligations that, while they consumed significant amounts of your time and material at prices set by convention rather than negotiation, at least fell within the normal range of smithing work and could be planned for roughly in advance. The extraordinary demands were another matter. When a lord decided to renovate or expand his fortifications, adding iron-reinforced gates, portcullises, window grills, door fittings for a new great hall, the local smith could find himself committed to months of intensive production at the lord's prices, with the lord's timeline, without any practical ability to decline or renegotiate. When a lord was called to war, which happened with uncomfortable frequency in medieval Europe, given the near-constant low-level military activity of the period and the occasional eruption of larger conflicts. His requirement for military ironwork became urgent and comprehensive. Horseshoes by the hundred, because war horses went through shoes at a prodigious rate on the mixed terrain of military campaigns. Arrowheads by the thousand, because medieval armies consumed projectiles at a rate that makes the logistics of pre-industrial warfare somewhat staggering to contemplate. Repairs to armor and weapons, because military equipment failed constantly under use and had to be maintained in the field or as close to it as possible. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms by which medieval lords requisitioned craft labor, and whether these mechanisms varied systematically by region, period, and the specific nature of the feudal relationship involved. What is clear from documentary evidence is that smiths in areas of military activity were among the most heavily burdened craftsmen during periods of conflict, and that the compensation for requisitioned military work was frequently inadequate, delayed, or in some cases never fully delivered. A lord preparing for campaign had more immediate concerns than settling his accounts with the local blacksmith, and the political and legal leverage available to a master smith trying to collect payment from a member of the nobility was, to put it gently, limited. The battlefield itself occasionally demanded your presence, which is an aspect of the medieval smith's military obligation that is less well known than it deserves to be. Large military forces, the armies of significant lords and certainly of kings, included attached craftsmen whose job was to maintain and repair military equipment in the field. Smiths were among the most essential of these attached craftsmen, because iron equipment failed constantly and the ability to repair a broken sword hilt, reshoe a horse, mend a damaged armor plate, or fabricate replacement components for siege equipment was tactically significant. Medieval campaign records, when they survive in sufficient detail, list among the force's components various specialist craftsmen including smiths, and the logistics of keeping these craftsmen supplied with fuel and materials while on campaign was a non-trivial organizational challenge. Being a campaign smith was not the romantic adventure that the proximity to military glory might suggest. You were not a warrior. You were a craftsman attached to a military force, which meant you experienced all of the hardship of campaign life, the marching, the inadequate food, the exposure to weather, the disease that moved through military camps with enthusiastic efficiency, without the social status of a soldier or the theoretical share of plunder that motivated fighting men to endure those hardships. You slept near your portable forge, which was a small, field-deployable version of your workshop equipment, and you worked as long as there was metal to repair and light to work by, which in the days before a significant engagement could mean working through the night. Camp fever, the collective term for the various diseases, primarily typhus and dysentery, that devastated medieval armies in the field, killed more soldiers and camp followers than combat in most medieval campaigns. The concentrated populations of military camps, the disrupted sanitation, the contaminated water, the stress-compromised immune systems of men on campaign, all of these factors created ideal conditions for infectious disease to spread rapidly through a force. Campaign smiths were not exempt from this mortality, and the historical record suggests that attrition among non-combatant specialists during medieval campaigns was significant, though it was less systematically recorded than combat casualties and therefore less visible to historians trying to reconstruct the human cost of medieval warfare. The siege was its own particular category of military smithing hell. Medieval sieges, the systematic assault on fortified positions, were among the most materially intensive military operations of the era, requiring the construction and maintenance of siege engines, battering rams, assault ladders, mining equipment, and all the iron hardware that connected wooden frames, held mechanisms together, and provided the countless functional fittings that engineering on this scale required. A siege that lasted weeks or months, and sieges frequently lasted weeks or months, because well-provisioned fortifications were extremely difficult to reduce quickly, consumed ironwork at a rate that stretched even well-supplied military smithies to their limits. The trebuchet, the most powerful siege engine of the high medieval period, was a machine of terrifying mechanical complexity that required sophisticated metalwork in its axle fittings, its release mechanisms, and the various reinforcing components that kept the frame from destroying itself under the stresses of repeated firing. A campaign smith tasked with maintaining trebuchet hardware was doing precision work under field conditions, without the proper tools and workspace of his home smithy, using whatever materials had been transported or could be locally sourced, and with the outcome of the military operation potentially depending on his ability to keep the machines functional. No pressure. The relationship between smiths and the military class was complicated further by the economics of weapon production, which connected your forge to networks of aristocratic patronage that were both lucrative and treacherous. The high end of the weapons market, the swords, the decorative helmets, the elaborate spurs and fittings that marked aristocratic military status, was where the real money in military smithing existed, and it was also where the real danger existed, because producing a weapon for a high-status client meant producing work that would be evaluated by someone with strong opinions, significant social power, and a direct personal interest in the result. A sword that failed in combat, that broke, or that turned out to have been made from iron of insufficient quality, or that simply did not perform to the knight's expectations, was a catastrophic professional failure with consequences that extended beyond the merely economic. Medieval accounts of craftsmen being punished for substandard work on aristocratic commissions exist in the documentary record, though the severity of consequences varied enormously with the specific circumstances and the lord involved. In the most extreme cases, a craftsman who produced genuinely dangerous defective work, a weapon that failed catastrophically, armor that offered inadequate protection, might face legal action, fines, or in the truly worst cases corporal punishment. More commonly, the consequences were professional and economic: loss of the lord's future patronage, damage to reputation that spread through aristocratic networks and closed other high-status doors. In a world where the patronage of powerful people was one of the main routes to business success, losing a lord's favor was serious in ways that went well beyond any single transaction. The arms trade also created moral and legal complications around the question of who you were allowed to sell weapons to. Medieval authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, periodically attempted to regulate the sale of weapons to various categories of buyer. Selling weapons to enemies of the crown was obviously prohibited and obviously dangerous if discovered. Selling weapons to people involved in ongoing feuds or private wars was legally murky in ways that the authorities tried to clarify through legislation and that craftsmen navigated through a combination of genuine ignorance and strategic incuriosity about their clients' intentions. The armorer or smith who asked too many questions about how a weapon would be used risked losing the sale. The one who asked too few risked becoming an accessory to whatever violence followed. Most navigated this dilemma by asking no questions at all and trusting that the transaction was the client's moral responsibility from the moment it was complete. A genuinely quirky dimension of the medieval smith's relationship with the military world involves the ritual significance of weaponry and the smith's role in it. Swords in particular carried symbolic weight far beyond their functional properties in medieval culture. They were objects of oath-taking, of investiture, of legal ceremony, and of the complex aristocratic honor culture that governed relationships among the fighting class. A sword commissioned for a specific ceremonial purpose might require decoration, inscription, or specific construction details that had ritual significance. Crosses on crossguards, specific metal compositions that legend or tradition associated with superior protective properties, blades made from recycled metal that had belonged to famous predecessors. These commissions put the smith in a mediating role between the practical and the symbolic, making objects that were simultaneously functional tools and sacred artifacts of aristocratic identity. The lord who sent Tuesday's messenger was not a particularly bad lord by medieval standards, which is a sentence that contains a great deal of qualification. He paid, eventually, most of what he owed, at prices that were somewhat below fair market rates but not catastrophically so. He did not demand the impossible, or when he did, he accepted with reasonable grace when the impossible turned out to be precisely that. He did not visit the smithy in person very often, which was almost always better than the alternative, because lords who visited smithies in person tended to have opinions about work in progress that were not improved by the visit. But he was still the lord, and his requirements still arrived without warning and without negotiation, and the gap between what he needed and what you had planned for your week was still a problem that was entirely yours to solve. You pushed your other clients back. You sent messages, or rather, you sent your apprentice because you could not leave the forge, explaining the delay and offering your regrets in the specific formulaic language that medieval tradespeople used to convey apology to clients without actually admitting fault, because admitting fault opened liability discussions you preferred to avoid. You rearranged your material orders. You calculated how much iron you needed for the Lord's commission and whether your current stock was sufficient or whether you needed to send for more, with all the cost and delay that involved. You mapped out the working sequence, which pieces could be done simultaneously, which had to be done in order because each depended on the previous one, which required the most precise temperature control and therefore had to be attempted when you were freshest rather than at the end of a 10-hour working day. And then you went to the forge and you began. Because this was the other thing about the Lord's demands, the thing that sat underneath the inconvenience and the unfairness and the compressed timeline and the below-market compensation. The work itself was often genuinely interesting. Large, complex commissions for powerful clients pushed your skills in ways that routine work did not. They required you to think, to plan, to solve problems that did not have obvious solutions, to produce things at a scale or with a precision that tested the limits of what you and your forge could do. There was, beneath the resentment, a craftsman's satisfaction in being given a difficult problem and producing a good answer to it. You were a smith. Difficult problems in iron were, in the end, your native language. The years accumulate the way scale accumulates on the smithy floor. Slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you look down and realize that the ground beneath your feet is significantly higher than it was when you started. Built up from the compressed residue of thousands of working days laid one on top of another in a record that is simultaneously everywhere and invisible. You are older now. The exact number of years depends on the particular mercy or cruelty of the life you have lived. But the body keeps its own count regardless of what the calendar says, and the body's count is always higher than the calendar's, always weighted by the specific mathematics of forge work, where each year of hammering ages the joints somewhat faster than a year of gentler occupation would, where each winter of smoke-breathing deposits its quiet tax on lung tissue that cannot be refunded or renegotiated. Your hair, where it remains, has gone the color of cooling iron, that particular gray that is not quite silver and not quite white but something in between, the color of metal deciding what temperature it wants to be. Your striking arm, that legendary arm that was already larger than its partner by your early 30s, has settled into a kind of magnificent decline. The muscle still there, still formidable by ordinary standards, but no longer the instrument of precision and endurance it once was, subject now to a tremor on cold mornings that takes an hour of warmth and movement to fully resolve, and to a deep ache in the shoulder joint that your younger self would have found alarming and that your present self has reclassified as simply Tuesday. The hand that held the tongs for 40 years tells its story in the way it opens and closes, or rather, in the way it does not quite open and close the way hands are supposed to, the way a healthy hand in a medical illustration does. Fingers extending fully and closing smoothly in a neat mechanical demonstration of what joints are theoretically capable of. Your fingers close adequately, mostly, when they have had time to warm up and when the day is not too cold and when you have remembered to work them through their morning exercises, which you learned from an older smith when you were a young journeyman and dismissed as the vanity of an aging man trying to forestall the inevitable, and which you have performed every morning for the past 15 years with the focused dedication of someone who now understands exactly what the exercises are postponing and exactly what will happen faster without them. You are still working. This is important to establish because the romantic notion of retirement, of a clean handover, a last working day, a celebratory drink with the journeyman, a dignified withdrawal to a cottage where you finally have time to sit still, is a fantasy that the medieval world did not provide the infrastructure to support. There was no pension. There was no guild retirement benefit, beyond whatever informal support the guild's mutual aid function might extend to an elderly member in genuine crisis, and that support was discretionary and limited and not something you could plan around. There was the work, and there was the question of how long you could keep doing enough of it to cover your costs, and after that there was the question of who would cover the costs instead, and neither of those questions had comfortable answers. What you have done over the past several years is a gradual negotiation with your own physical limits, a quiet, undramatic renegotiation of which tasks you still do yourself and which you delegate to your journeyman, a young man of 23 with a strong arm and a good eye and considerably more energy than you currently possess at any point in the working day. You still do the work that requires judgment, the reading of metal color, the assessment of a commission's requirements, the decisions about alloy and technique and sequence that draw on 4 decades of accumulated experience and that no amount of physical strength can substitute for. You let the journeyman do the heavy hammer work, the extended bellows pumping, the carrying and lifting that your back has been registering complaints about since approximately your 42nd year. This arrangement is economically precarious in a specific way because the journeyman's wages are a fixed cost that you carry regardless of how much work comes in, and as you do less of the physical production yourself, your output decreases even as your overhead remains roughly stable. The math of this situation has a direction, and the direction is not encouraging, and you are aware of it with the same persistent low-level awareness with which you are aware of your shoulder and your lungs and the ringing that has been your constant companion for so many years. That silence, on the rare occasions when you encounter it, feels somehow wrong, incomplete, like a familiar song with a verse missing. Your apprentice, your current apprentice, the third you have taken over your career, is a boy of 14 named, let us say, Thomas, because Thomas is a common enough name in medieval England to serve without specificity. Thomas is at roughly the stage you were at after 2 years of your own apprenticeship. Past the initial period of pure observation and unskilled labor, beginning to develop some genuine feel for the bellows rhythm and the color reading, making nails with increasing efficiency, starting to understand in his hands rather than just his head what it means when the metal moves a certain way under the hammer. He is not remarkable, Thomas. He is a competent, moderately attentive boy who will probably become a solid journeyman and possibly a reasonable master if the economics work out for him. But watching him develop is one of the genuine satisfactions of your later working years, a satisfaction that has nothing to do with profit or guild standing or the Lord's requirements and everything to do with the simple fact of passing something on. The knowledge you carry is not written down, and this is its great vulnerability. The embodied knowledge of the smith, the kinesthetic wisdom of 40 years at the anvil, the color library in your eyes that can read the temperature of iron across a dozen shades of orange and yellow and white with a precision no instrument of your era can match, the felt sense of how metal moves under the hammer in each phase of its working temperature. All of this lives in your body, and your body is mortal, and when your body is gone, this knowledge is gone with it unless you have managed to transfer enough of it to the people who worked alongside you. This is why the apprenticeship system, for all its documented cruelties and economic exploitations, served a function that had no real alternative in a pre-literate craft world. The knowledge could not be written in a way that preserved its most important elements. You could write or have written that iron at orange heat is workable and iron at yellow-white heat is dangerously close to burning, but the writing would not give a reader the ability to see that distinction in the actual color of actual metal in actual firelight, which is a perceptual skill that takes years of exposure to develop and that no description, however precise, can fully substitute for. The apprentice's body had to learn what your body knew, and the only way for that transfer to happen was proximity. Years of standing near the forge, watching, imitating, failing, adjusting, watching again, until the knowledge moved from observation into muscle memory into the wordless certainty of the practiced hand. There is a quirky footnote to the history of medieval craft knowledge transmission involving a small number of written technical manuals that circulated among European craftsmen. Documents like the 12th century Schedula Divers Arum Artium of Theophilus Presbyter, a German monk who wrote detailed instructions for various craft processes including metalwork. These documents are genuinely remarkable for their technical precision and for what they reveal about the state of craft knowledge in their era. But they were rare, they were in Latin which most working craftsmen could not read, and they were oriented toward a monastic audience that practiced craft in a different context than the commercial smithy. Historians still argue about whether written technical traditions had any meaningful influence on the day-to-day practice of working smiths, or whether they existed in a parallel intellectual world that rarely intersected with the embodied knowledge of the workshop. Your legacy, then, is Thomas, and before Thomas was a journeyman named William who worked in your shop for 6 years before moving to a town 20 miles away where he has, you have heard, established a modest but functional workshop of his own. And before William was an apprentice whose name you still think of with a complicated mixture of fondness and frustration, who had genuine talent and also a genuine inability to arrive at the forge on time in the mornings, a failing that no amount of correction, of the formal medieval variety, seemed to permanently address, and that eventually resolved itself when he completed his indenture and became, presumably, his own problem to manage. These are your professional children, in a sense, the people who carry portions of your knowledge forward into a future you will not see, who will stand at their own anvils and read their own iron by color and feel, and who will sometimes, you hope, though you will never know, do something in the way you showed them and feel the rightness of it as a thing that came from you. The health of your later years is exactly what the trajectory of the earlier years predicted, which is to say it is not good, but it is not as bad as it might have been if the specific dice of disease and accident had fallen differently. Your lungs are compromised, the cough is a permanent feature now, worse in winter, occasionally alarming in its persistence and depth, and there are mornings when the first hour of the day involves a negotiation with your respiratory system that you do not always feel confident about winning. A physician, had you the means and inclination to consult one, would probably not have very much useful to offer you beyond the observation that men who spent their lives breathing forged smoke tended to have lungs that showed it, which is the kind of medical insight that is accurate but not actionable. Your hearing has reached a plateau of loss that is simply your auditory world now, a world in which conversation at normal volumes requires concentration, in which the higher frequencies of sound have faded almost entirely, in which the tinnitus that once seemed intrusive has become so fundamental a feature of your sonic landscape that you genuinely cannot remember, most days, what silence sounded like before it arrived. You have adapted. The human capacity for adaptation to permanent sensory change is remarkable, and yours has been exercised thoroughly enough that the adaptation feels complete. Not comfortable exactly, not what you would have chosen, but incorporated, integrated, yours. The forge itself is showing its age alongside you, which feels appropriate. The stone of the hearth has cracked in 2 places from decades of thermal cycling and has been patched with a clay and grit mixture that works adequately. The bellows has been rebuilt 3 times, the leather deteriorates with heat and use, and you have replaced it in sections and eventually in whole, so that what you pump now is technically a different bellows from the one you started with, though it sits in the same frame and does the same work. The anvil is as it always was. Anvils, made of good iron and used correctly, outlast their smiths by generations, and yours will go to whoever follows you in this workshop with all the wear marks of your working life already pressed into its surface. Your hammer's path worn into the face in patterns that will slowly blend with whoever comes after. The workshop itself, the building, the space, the particular geography of forge and anvil and tool rack that you have arranged and rearranged over decades into its optimal configuration, will be taken on by your journeyman Thomas when he is ready, or sold to another smith, or converted to another use if the trade in this location becomes less viable as the town's economy shifts and changes around it. Towns changed. Trades relocated. The blacksmith who had been essential in one generation's economic geography sometimes found himself peripheral in the next, as roads changed and markets moved, and the particular pattern of local demand that had sustained one workshop failed to sustain another. You have seen this happen to smithies in neighboring towns and have watched the smiths involved navigate the slow diminishment of their client base with varying degrees of success and grace. Medieval retirement, such as it was, typically took one of a small number of forms. If you had children, and you have 2 surviving children, which represents a reasonable outcome given the childhood mortality rates of your era, and if those children were willing and able, the expectation was that they would provide for you in your reduced capacity in exchange for the inheritance of whatever you had accumulated. This was an informal social contract rather than a legal requirement, and its reliability depended on the character of your children and the quality of your relationships with them, which over a lifetime of hard work and limited time and the various strains that medieval family life imposed was not uniformly excellent in every family. The medieval equivalent of grown children who did not adequately support their elderly parents was a recognized social problem, commented on in literature and sermons with a weary familiarity that suggests it was common enough to be worth addressing repeatedly. If you had no children, or if your children could not support you, the guild's mutual aid function was the next recourse, followed by the informal charity of neighbors and community, followed by the church's institutional charity in the form of almshouses and hospitals that accepted elderly and infirm people who had no other resource. The almshouse was the destination of last resort, and the prospect of ending there, surrendering the independence of your own workshop and household for the communal dependency of institutional charity, was one that most medieval craftsmen viewed with the particular dread that comes from having spent a life in fierce practical independence. You sit at the end of a working day, not every day but more days than before, because the standing is harder than it was, on a stool near the forge door where the air is cooler but the light is still good. The forge behind you breathes its low fire, banked for the night but never entirely cold because keeping a fire going is cheaper and easier than starting one from scratch each morning. A practical calculation that you made so many times it stopped being a calculation and became simply the way things are. The light outside is going. The town is settling into its evening sounds, the calls of people finishing their days, the animals being brought in, the particular acoustic texture of a medieval settlement in its daily wind down. Your hands rest on your knees, and you look at them in the fading light. These extraordinary, damaged, capable hands that have made so many things, that carry in their scars and their stiffness and their remarkable strength the entire autobiography of your working life. They are not beautiful hands. They are not the hands of a man who did something gentle with his years. They are the hands of a smith, and they are yours, and they made the world a little more solid and functional and connected than it would have been without them. And now, as the forge light softens and the evening deepens around you, let the weight of that long day slowly lift. You have done enough. You have always done enough. The hammer is still. The iron is cool. The fire breathes low and quiet, and there is nothing more that is required of you tonight, or right now, in this particular moment of rest that you have honestly earned. Let the sounds of the smithy fade, the ringing of the anvil that lives in your memory more than your ears now, the hiss of the quench, the steady rhythm of the bellows. Let them soften into something more like music than work, the sounds of a life fully lived in one dedicated place, at one particular fire in service of a world that needed what you made. You were never famous. Your name does not appear in chronicles. No stained glass window commemorates your contributions, though the iron fittings of several church windows owe their continued existence to the quality of your work. You were simply present, day after day, in the heat and the noise and the demanding particularity of your craft, and that presence accumulated into something quiet and substantial and real. The night is coming in now, soft and cool, and the stiffness in your hands is easing, and the cough has settled, and the ringing, that faithful, lifelong companion, has gentled into something almost like the sound of the wind, or the sound of water, or the sound of nothing in particular, which is perhaps the sound that rest makes when it finally, genuinely arrives. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath slow and deepen. The forge will be here in the morning. The work will be here in the morning. But morning is a long way away, and between now and then there is only this, the cooling air, the dimming light, the quiet that gathers around a life of noise like a kindness long overdue. You were a blacksmith. You made things that mattered. And now, at last, you rest.